Okay.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
All right, just for a start, tell us who you are.
I'm Hope Bartley. I'm from Jamaica. I'm an artist and architect. And I'm based in Munich, Germany.
And now, tell us who you are.
Who I am? I mean, I think it will be the same thing. I mean, who I am, you know, I'm just a person trying to figure out a way through life, I guess. Yeah.
Have you always been living in Germany?
Now I've been here, I think 8 years now. Arrived in, I think, um, 8, 9 years. Arrived end of 2016 to do my master's in architecture. And then finished this, and then I went from there. I worked a few years as architect, still working as an architect, but then I realized around 4 or 5 years ago that what really inspires me is art. To be free from the restrictions of physics, so to speak. Yeah.
So you're working both jobs, or so is work is art your work, or is it still a hobby? How would you describe it?
Art is work. I mean, it's a hobby. It's both, but it's work because hobbies, you don't have to do hobbies. Hobbies, you can just, if you're busy on a day, you just don't do it. But work, you have like a certain time which you have to perform. So I think it's a bit of both. I enjoy doing it like a hobby, but it's also work. Yeah.
How did you get to produce art in the first place?
How did I get to produce art? It's a tough question. I mean, I've always been creative in different ways. As a kid, I used to watch a lot of anime. I used to draw anime. Just in the back of my book. It's actually funny because I thought about this a few days ago. I did something as a kid that was really bad. I mean, really bad. As a kid, it probably wasn't never that bad, but I got punished, and mom was like, "You can't draw any more anime." I was like, "That's my punishment." And so because I couldn't draw anime anymore, it's okay. You know what? I'm going to draw real people. Because I just had to draw something. I couldn't just not draw. So then I started drawing, some real people. As good as I could at the time. I was like, this is not too different from anime. Eyes are a little smaller, head is a little less round, but it's also a lot of fun, and that's kind of how I started like drawing people. Yeah.
Do you follow a certain style? Was the inspirations?
I don't follow style, so to speak. Um, I'm more trying to follow the feeling that I want to like show, like something I think about before I do any piece of work. I sit and I think, what do I want to show from this work? How can I dissect it so that my idea is delivered, in the most cohesive way? And I guess intrinsically that somehow forms a kind of style, but it's not a deliberate style, so to speak.
Explain your art to us. Like, is there an inspiration? Is there a certain idea behind it? Do you have certain main motifs that maybe repeat themselves?
Well, I would say the main motif in my art is probably psychology and trauma, just in general. So very non-specific, but I've dealt with certain things in life, like all human beings. But because I'm an artist, I solve it through my art. So when it comes to like things like Verletzlichkeit, I don't know what this is in English. What's Verletzlichkeit? No idea. Vulnerability. There we go. Sometimes I forget my English words. Weirdly enough, I've been here for too long. But like situations like vulnerability, I've been through situations which just kind of like challenge my ability to like be vulnerable. Also, just being in 21st century, and also being male. As much as we have these movements now, which is like inspiring this vulnerability, we're far from it. End of the day, when God forbid a war breaks out, you have to perform. You have to like forget all those political stuff. You have to be ready to do that. And that's something that used to affect me. Not necessarily war per se. I mean, yes, now a bit more war because war is like at our doorsteps. But before it was just like just everyday things. Things sentences I hear from people. used to affect me in a certain way, and I decided to like channel that into my art. So I developed my convergence body of work. Um, it was about like channeling that vulnerability and that openness, like as in a masculine way, in a way that I thought I needed to do it. I mean, it probably doesn't apply to everybody, but it applied to me at the time, and that's why those works focus on um, self-portraits. Because it was a very personal body of work. It was just about expressing that, in rawness.
Is so you mentioned self-portraits already.
Mm-hmm.
How does your art? I guess it's not, or I know it's not exclusively self-portraits.
Mm-hmm.
How does your art look? How would you describe it visually?
I would say my art is very tactile. I like when my image becomes a little more than just an image. It becomes like a object. That's kind of like always my goal in my work. So, for example, my work does have a lot of like tactile, three-dimensional elements. Most of my work. I mean, sometimes you don't really see that from portraiture, but from photos. But when you see it in person, you see there is a certain three-dimensionality to my work, and that's what I would say is like probably the main leitmotif when it comes to my work. I also try to go for a level of like inclusivity. Not to be it means in a political way, but just that my muse or my subjects tend to be not just one type of person, not just one type of body, but just like a real, just raw people. And actually, what I would say, like probably the biggest thing about my work, apart from the tactile elements, is like I don't like to have like a sense of time in my pieces. So, for example, that's why a lot of my work tend to be like nudes. Um, and they're nudes, and they have no makeup, they have no tattoos, no jewelry, because like I want that if someone sees this work in 2,000 years, let's say for example my work was lucky enough to survive 2,000 years or even 100 years, you wouldn't be able to tell that, okay, this work is a painting of a person, a man or woman in 2020. You just look at it as a painting of a man, or a woman. You wouldn't be able to like tell the time, so to speak. And I think that's to me very important, because the second you start, well, for me, second you start like pinning people down to a particular time, people start to lose the essence of like the issue that you're actually trying to tackle in the body of work. So, for example, you're tackling, not to be overly concrete, but let's say, for example, you're tackling, for example, my topic of male vulnerability. Someone might look at this in 2100 and be, oh, but that's an issue of 2025. We don't know. This is an issue that always exists, you know? Yeah, it's not just, and it's also, obviously, it's not just focused on like the masculine, but vulnerability is an issue that society will always face forever, both men and women, because we're living in a society where you have to perform all the time, you know? You have to always do what you have to do, or society falls apart. At least that's the idea we're told. As a result, that's why I try to strip away these elements of time and place, so it doesn't get stuffed into, oh, that's a Jamaican problem. Oh, that's a 2025 problem. This is a problem that humanity has always had, and will probably continue to have in varying degrees for eternity. You know. Yeah.
You've already addressed a few issues. There's a few more issues about your art.
Mm-hmm.
That if you paint a self-portrait, it's obviously inevitable that the person in the picture is dark-skinned.
Yeah.
So are most of your pictures, even if it's not you.
Mm-hmm.
Explain your thinking behind that.
Okay, so I'll start clear. I mean, my earlier work was very Afrocentric, and the reason for this was that when I first started, so as I started off doing anime, and in anime, like always light skin, if anyone watch anime, we all know, even though Japanese are like dark-haired people, there's always at least 4 blonde characters, with blue eyes, always light haired. There's like, why is this, what is occurring? When you start to like analyze, you realize our society is so like Eurocentric in this way. If you type beautiful woman or beautiful man, you find, or if you type doctor, you find a white doctor, just because like that's how our society has been like molded. Even though Asians occupy what, probably 40% of the population. This is probably a wrong number, but like it's just the fact that they take up so much space in terms of media that it's easy to forget that other people exist. And so that's kind of my goal for at first with tackling the whole issue of colorism. It was to like normalize seeing like a black face in art, because I mean now it's become a little more mainstream, so to speak. People paint them just as a trope. Both people, black and white people paint it as a trope because now it's a thing. But when I started doing it, not to say it's anything revolutionary, but for me it was about normalizing it. And then as I slightly began to move from this slight motif, I transitioned to my self-portraits, and even then people were so like uncomfortable with the idea of seeing a black face in varying degrees. Some people they interpret it in different ways, but people would ask me, why am I drawing so many black people? And I said, it's not black people, it's me. It's a self-portrait, It'll be literally impossible for me to draw a self-portrait of an Asian or a white man. This is what you get when you make a self-portrait. You get yourself, and this kind of like showed me that our society is not yet seeing like the black image as a normal occurring aspect of life. It's more something that has always been seen with the veil of like politics, and so that's kind of like one of the issues I used to tackle in my earlier work. And now in my newer works, I'm way more inclusive in like who I decide to draw or paint. And what I do with this inclusivity is that now when you do see a black person appearing in a painting, you can kind of strip away this idea of like politics, because that's not what it is. It's just that I had 5 models, and of these 5 models, 2 of them were black, 2 were white, 1 was Asian, in whichever mix. And more, it's not anything more than this. It's just that's the way it is. If you decide to like pinpoint the black skin or the Asian person, then maybe it's a more question you should be asking yourself: why does that seem so weird to you? That there's a non-white person in this painting.
So that mostly came from reactions by other people.
For sure.
You lean towards this specific motivation that you have at the moment.
Yeah, for sure.
How would art ideally be seen?
I mean, how it's seen, that's a very individual question, I would say. People see art in different ways. Or maybe you can rephrase the question so I can...
You just described that, well, probably the majority of people who would be white see you painting a painting of you that shows a black person, and they immediately assume that the person is black for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
So they have a certain way to see that art. So how would you want them to see your art?
Just art. The same way you look at the Leonardo da Vinci and you don't think, white woman. It's just Mona Lisa, beautiful painting, end of story. You look at a Van Dyck portrait. The painting of a white man. No, it's just Van Dyck. It's nothing political. Van Dyck was not trying to like do anything specific with painting a Dutchman in whatever century it was. It's just a painting. It's not anything more than this. And the difference is that if you look at like using Van Dyck as like, for example, when you look at the Van Dyck, people then begin to like look at the emotions that Van Dyck is like, trying to express, and that becomes a topic. Not Van Dyck's color. What becomes a topic is the emotions he's trying to convey, the deliberate nature of some of his strokes. Why did he do the strokes like this? And I think that this becomes lost when you focus on the skin color. Something I've realized, like people begin to start focusing on black, and they start looking at police brutality, but that's not what it's about. There are more layers to just being a human being, more than just like the color of my skin. So that's kind of it. It makes the entire rhetoric very superficial, because like you don't open yourself up to like understanding the deeper nature of this painting. Like there's been so many debates about what does the Mona Lisa mean, you know. And but the thing, the narrative changed. The Mona Lisa was black. You would just be like, so it's a black woman and it's trying to make, it becomes very superficial, and that's why I would like to, like, first of all, normalize the image as being just a normal part. It's a normal part of society, a normal part of art. First of all, second of all is like to then go to the second layer, which is actually just the emotion that you can see being shown through the eyes, through the tonality, through the use of light. Yeah.
Do you think you're being treated differently as an artist because of your appearance?
I mean, we always get treated differently because of appearance. It's not always political or racial. It's just you always get treated because of your appearance. You can't avoid this. It's a subconscious thing that happens between human beings. I mean, so for sure, 100%.
Can you give me an example?
An example of how I'm treated differently? I mean, I can give you an example. Like when I just arrived here. I mean, this might be trigger warning, I guess. You can probably beep it out. So like, for example, when I got here, I was looking for an apartment, and I remember like I applied for an apartment, and then so I'm just trying to get the facts straight so I don't like misconvey the story. But I'm like before, so my name is not intrinsically a black name. My name is Hope Bartley or Hope Bartley. It's a British name, so to speak. And so when I applied for the apartment at first, woman was very forthcoming. She was very, very nice. She's very, very open. Told me she had many apartments. Then when I set my passport picture, because sometimes you have to do this just to prove that you're here legally. She realized I was black. All of a sudden the treatment changed. She was like, okay, why is your visa only saying 6 months? I'm like, because when you get a student visa, you get only 6 months. In the 6 months, you have to find an apartment. And when you get the apartment, you carry it to the bank, and then the bank releases because also to come here, you need, I think at the time, 9,000 euros in your bank account. So I had to then get my rent contract, bring it to my bank, and then only then will they open my account so I'm able to like pull my own money, And that's how the system is. And then when you access your money, then you go to the foreigner's office, and then you prove to them that you have an apartment, your bank account is not open, and then now they give you the extended 2 years for the remainder of your studies. That's how it is. I didn't make the system. It's what the system I came here into. And then she said to me, when I explained that to her, she said to me, oh, she's never experienced that before. So like, well, yes, you wouldn't, because you're a German woman. Why would you be doing a master's with a Jamaican passport? You don't have that problem. It's my problem. And then also, when it became like she was just not believing me. I was like, for you, it shouldn't. I'm paying my rent. It shouldn't matter to you what's the legal process in order to get my visa extended. Anyway, then she sent me into like the apartment she sent me to was actually a terrible apartment. It was like 19 square meters, and I remember like I think this was like the apartment she just like stuffed all of her foreigners in. Like she tried to just replace foreigner with foreigner. And when the apartment was like not taken care of, it was like literally you step out the bed, and you step out the bed, you're already in the shower. Like literally, there was no space. I think the toilet was also in the shower, actually. And when I looked at the apartment, I declined it. And then when I declined it, she was like, she would never give me an apartment again. It's like, am I not allowed to decline an apartment? Like this is how it works, You look at an apartment, you don't like it, to decline it, And then so, anyways, long story short, I then found an apartment with someone else. And I remember when my first week in the apartment, someone drew a Hakenkreuz, Schwarzika in English, of my Briefkasten. What is it? What do you call it? Briefkasten in English again? I forget. Mailbox. There we go. They drew like a Schwarzika, And I was like, go home. I was like, And then I went to the police. I reported, of course, because when you see Nazis, you should report it. Like that's what I thought. And then like went there, didn't speak in German at the time. And then the police was like, you don't speak German, Actually, I said in English, actually. You don't speak German. We're in Germany. If you want to make a report, you have to speak German. I'm like, yeah, but this is a hate crime, I could probably die tomorrow. Like, this something, why you can wait till I die to respond to this case? It's like, no, no, you're in Germany. If you're not speaking German, we can't look at the case. I'm like, it's crazy. Luckily, a police in the back heard the situation. He came out and like wrote it off for us, and we filed a report. Nothing was done, but at least someone heard, came and helped. So those are like issues I face, for example, being not white.
Is that how you generally experience being, well, not white, as you phrase it in Germany? Or?
No, no, no. I would say no. I mean, I have situations where you should really be careful, and I think now, especially this was like 8 years ago, I think people have become a lot more politically correct now, so to speak. So even if someone's thinking, they're not saying it, but I've had situations even like when I just came here, like, say I'm an architect and no one believed me, like, yeah, but did you study? I'm like, yes, of course I studied. I say become, it's like me saying I'm a doctor, I didn't go to med school. I'm an architect because I studied architecture. I have a master's degree in architecture, but yeah, people just not believe me, like sometimes that like I'm qualified, so, but it's not all the people, just to be clear. You have to always be clear these days. It's not all the people, it's not most people, but it's enough people that it's obvious,
If you met yourself 8 to 9 years ago, is there something is there any helpful advice you could give yourself?
Yeah, I would say do less deadlifts. It hurts your back. Yeah, yeah, it's not worth it doing that many deadlifts. No, but seriously, yeah, my advice would probably, I mean, and it's funny. I actually thought about this question like literally, cause I saw it on Instagram. Like like I think yesterday. Like, what would be the advice I'd give my a high school version of myself? I don't know. I feel like it's crazy because like all the mistakes I made and all the decisions that I did make like turned me into this person that I'm right now, and I like this person. And like anything I change in the line becoming this person could possibly deter who I became now, So like, do I want to stop that? Do I want to like create a reality where I do exist? I don't know. Um, it's crazy. It's a complicated question because I don't think I made any bad decisions, so to speak. I mean, the only thing I could probably think about is like, not to be that negative, but like don't study architecture. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy being an architect. Oh, sorry, no, I enjoy architecture. You know, but the issues in the field of work. I probably studied psychology instead, something like this. I don't think I'd have studied art, but probably psychology. Yeah, yeah, probably I've probably done a master's in psychology. Actually, I started a master's in psychology. Right before I came here, started the first semester. It was online master's in Liverpool, and then like I decided to end that to do my master's in psychology. Maybe I'll say, yo, don't end that. Finish it, and then think about architecture. Maybe that'd be my advice, because I feel like there's like certain advantages to understanding the mind more. Not to be like cliche, but for sure there's certain advantages you get from like just you know just like being able to peel back the layers of like human existence and like understand why people do what they do, because so many things we do are like just like trauma responses. Funny enough, I was speaking to a woman like I think a week ago, and we're speaking about like sickness in general, and she said like, for example, she had like an autoimmune deficiency, and like she touched here, and I was like, oh, it's in your thyroid. She's like, yeah, how you know? I'm like you signal it, because people always signal the trauma, like in some way, like, and I was like, yeah, you signal it, like without subconscious, because your body holds on to this pain, and like sometimes you don't even know it, like even like some people like might sit like this, and it's just like you trying to protect yourself because like you probably grew up in a society in a situation where it was never really safe, you know. It could have been physical, it could have been psychological, but just things like this, which kind of like really like it kind of shows you like how the human being, navigates this world. That things hold actually a way larger, it takes a way larger toll on us, and we realize, on the subconscious level.
One question. So we have this association which also tries to portray that to go beyond the label immigrant, right? The word immigrant,
Mm-hmm.
because that's for us is also something superficial,
Mm-hmm.
and we want to that people go beyond it and just see it as a person, as a human being, and not as just someone that comes from another place, but as well get to the point. What are the complexities? What are the emotions of this human being, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you see using art, using music to get to that level when it comes to the topic of immigration?
I would say first. Firstly, I would say that's kind of like what my art kind of does in a way, because like this whole idea of the image. Because also when we speak about immigrants, we're not referring to like a Slovenian moving to Germany. That's not who we're talking about. That's not who they see as immigrants. Like they're okay. When we say immigrants, we look at the people, like, I hate this term, but people of color. So I hate that term, but that's who they're speaking about. It's like, so it's like by normalizing this image, the same way we have normalized the look of the white phenotype. I think that kind of like also will dissolve the strength that immigration has, or the term immigrant has. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say. And I think that's for me like the main issue actually, is that when we say immigrant, like we're literally just speaking about brown people and black people, no one else. The situation, for example, again to be political, with the Trump administration, he was speaking of immigrants the entire time, and there was then a situation where he was then offering like, I think some, for example, white South Africans, for example, to come to the country, to like get farmland. And you realize the issue is not immigration, the issue is not being white, So I would first of all, I would tell people like, first of all, don't be offended by the word immigration, because I think being offended by a word is what gives it power. Second of all, like let's normalize looking, for example, not like the white phenotype. I think that's the biggest issue actually, is that that's seen as like the base normal, and everything else is a variation from that. You know.
Is there anything you feel like that hasn't been mentioned yet that you'd like to address?
No, I think we touched on many topics. I think first there's a lot to like, to sift through, and if we need to talk about anything else, I'm available.
Perfect. Let's look forward to part two.
Yeah, for
Thank
sure.
you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.